Castles weren't just built to look cool. They were military supercomputers made of stone, designed to trap, confuse, and humiliate even the smartest armies of their time. Forget firepower. These defenses fought with physics, psychology, and poop. A castle wasn't just a wall, it was a machine. Every tower, window, and staircase was part of a system. One big, brainy trap designed to make invaders suffer long before a single sword was drawn. Step 1. Location. Medieval lords didn't build castles where the view was nice. They built them where it hurt. Hilltops, cliffs, narrow valleys, places where attackers had to march uphill for hours, completely exposed, before they even reached the gate. Some castles even angled their walls so enemy siege towers would tilt and collapse before they made contact. Welcome to medieval architecture, where gravity was the first line of defense. But the real genius wasn't in where the castle sat. It was in how it thought. Take the gatehouse, supposedly the front door. Except it wasn't a door. It was a psychological torture chamber. The enemy would think they were finally in, and then realize they were stuck in a stone hallway the length of a bus, with murder holes above, arrow slits on both sides, and 2 sets of iron gates slamming shut behind them. That's not an entrance, that's a blender. Some gatehouses even had double portcullises, giant iron grates that dropped from the ceiling. The trick? Let the attackers into the passageway, then drop the first grate behind them, and the second in front. Congratulations, you're now in a cage. A very loud, very smoky, very arrow-filled cage. Defenders would pour boiling water or oil from above, not for the kill, but for the panic. Screaming soldiers jammed together in a stone hallway. That hallway just became a bottleneck of terror. Now imagine you make it past the gatehouse. You've breached the front lines, right? Wrong. You've just entered the next layer of mind games, the bailey or courtyard. It looks open, it looks safe, but it's been designed to channel your army into kill zones, narrow passages, open fields surrounded by walls, and turns that lead nowhere. While you're figuring out where to go next, archers on the walls are figuring out where to put their next arrow. And then there were false gates, openings that looked like the way in but led to dead ends or sudden drops. One castle in Wales featured a decoy entrance that led straight into a pit lined with iron spikes. Another had a friendly path leading up a hill, only to put you directly below the main tower, perfectly exposed to every slingshot and rock the defenders could find. But even if you made it through the courtyard alive, the nightmare was just beginning, because now you had to climb the stairs. Spiral staircases were some of the smartest features in medieval military design. You probably think they were there to save space. Not quite. They were death traps, specifically built to favor right-handed defenders. Here's how it worked. The staircase always spiraled clockwise as you ascended. That meant attackers coming up would have their sword arm, usually right, stuck against the central pillar, leaving them barely enough space to swing. Meanwhile, defenders coming down had full range of motion, their sword arms free and clear. It turned every staircase into a one-man fortress. Add a few archers stationed at the top with crossbows. That spiral became a corkscrew of corpses. Oh, and the steps themselves. They weren't even. Some were deliberately made shorter or taller than others to trip up unfamiliar feet. Defenders trained on them daily. Attackers stumbled, literally. And let's not forget the murder holes, one of the castle's most iconic brainchildren. These were slits or trapdoors in ceilings that let defenders drop everything from boiling oil to rocks to flaming sand on enemies below. One castle in France reportedly used a mix of hot vinegar and powdered lime, a combo that blinded invaders and burned their lungs. Your chemical warfare medieval edition. Sometimes they even used bees. Yes, actual beehives dropped through murder holes. Nothing says please retreat like flaming honey and angry insects falling from the ceiling. And while all of this was happening, the castle was still thinking ahead. Some fortresses had Z-shaped inner gatehouses, designed to force attackers into sharp turns where they had to break formation. Others had double curtain walls, one low outer wall and a much higher inner wall. So even if you captured the first wall, you were now stuck in a valley of death, exposed on all sides to crossfire from above. At that point, it didn't matter how many soldiers you had. You weren't fighting an army anymore. You were fighting a building, with better tactics than your general. You've made it past the gatehouse. You've dodged the arrows, ducked the oil, and somehow didn't fall into a pit full of spikes. Congratulations. You're now exactly where the defenders wanted you, because castles weren't built to keep people out. They were built to let you in, just far enough to kill you more efficiently. Let's start with the courtyard trap. Most castles had an open area just behind the main gate. To an invading army, it looked like progress. Open space, breathing room, a place to regroup. Except that space was a kill box. Surrounded on all sides by walls with firing positions, this courtyard was designed to funnel invaders into tight clusters, with nowhere to hide and no cover. Defenders had every angle, archers on towers, boiling liquid from above, even slingshots loaded with rocks and waste. One English castle included a stone ledge specifically for dropping sewage on invaders from the kitchen. That's right. Imagine charging a fortress and getting taken out by last week's stew. And don't think the layout was random. Castles used the landscape like chess players. Outer walls were built with inward-facing angles, forcing attackers to curve along the perimeter in a predictable direction. This wasn't a wall, it was a funnel. And at the end of that funnel, a second wall, taller and meaner than the first, with archers waiting like snipers on a balcony. Some castles even included concentric design, meaning multiple layers of defense rings, wall after wall, gate after gate, each one tighter, higher, and more punishing than the last. Think of it like a medieval onion, except every layer makes you cry for a different reason. But the real genius, that was in the layout psychology. Certain castles had intentionally confusing floor plans, hallways that looped back on themselves, towers that looked identical, and staircases that led to dead ends. One fortress in Germany was famous for its Hall of Doors, where 10 identical wooden doors lined a hallway. 9 led to walls. The 10th led to a spiral staircase lined with arrow slits. Now let's talk about kill zones. These weren't just physical, they were positional. Castle architects would deliberately create bends and zigzags in key passageways. Why? Because a straight hallway is great for a charging army. A zigzag, that's where formations fall apart, and once your shield wall is broken, you're basically lining up to be skewered one by one. Then came the dead ends, corridors that invited attackers in, only to trap them with locked doors, collapsing beams, or secret entrances behind them. Some castles even had fall-away floors, activated by hidden levers, that dropped soldiers into pits or cells. Imagine being the first guy to step in, then realizing you're not in the castle anymore. You're in the basement and no one's coming to get you. One underrated feature, wall walkways with choke points. Defenders could retreat through narrow passages where only one person at a time could follow, giving even a tired soldier the chance to defend against 5 men without being surrounded. These were escape lanes that doubled as ambush zones. And don't get too comfortable with the open spaces either. The inner courtyards often had false gates, archways that appeared to lead to the next level, but were actually dead ends. Some even had angled doors that, when opened, exposed the attackers back to a tower full of archers. That's right. Open the wrong door, and you just offered your spine as target practice. Even the height of the towers was strategic. Ever notice how some castles have uneven tower heights? That's not poor planning, it's deliberate. Lower towers forced attackers to climb up, only to realize the taller ones behind them could rain death the whole way. The first tower was bait, the second tower was checkmate. And those defender passageways you barely notice in ruins today? Those were how small teams of castle guards could vanish, reappear behind enemy lines, and wipe out intruders from behind. One report from a siege in the 14th century describes defenders sneaking through the walls to ambush sleeping soldiers inside the outer ward. It was less a castle and more a haunted house with swords, but maybe the most brutal feature of all, the trap staircases. Some castles included stairwells that looked normal, until you realized they spiraled in the opposite direction. Why? To trick attackers used to the clockwise equals disadvantage rule. These reverse spirals confused the enemy, and worse, they sent them upward into traps, where the stair ended in a tiny platform with no door, no exit, and no mercy. So by the time your army captured the first part of the castle, you hadn't won. You'd just walked into a giant mousetrap, and the bait was your own ego. Let's talk about the moat. You probably picture a calm, scenic trench full of water, maybe with a few ducks paddling around. Peaceful, right? Now picture that water filled with mud, spikes, dead animals, and the contents of the castle toilet system. That's more like it, because in the Middle Ages the moat wasn't for decoration. It was the first weapon in the castle's liquid arsenal, and it wasn't always wet. Dry moats were some of the most vicious traps ever dug. Deep trenches lined with jagged rocks or sharpened wooden stakes, designed to snap ankles and swallow siege towers whole. These weren't moats you swam across. They were moats that chewed you up before you ever saw the gate. Even the wet moats weren't just pools of water. They were engineered obstacles. Castles built near rivers or lakes could divert water using canals and sluice gates, flooding their moats on command. One castle in France could raise its moat level by 2 feet in under an hour. Surprise, you're now waist-deep in freezing water and can't move fast enough to dodge arrows. Some moats were built on a slope, so attackers trying to cross were always fighting against water pushing them back downhill. Think medieval treadmill, except instead of weight loss, you got hypothermia and an arrow to the chest. And if you somehow managed to cross, congratulations, here's your reward, the drawbridge. This wasn't some rickety plank. Medieval drawbridges were precision engineered with counterweights, gears and locks. They could be raised in under 30 seconds. If your timing was off by even a moment, you were stuck outside, soaked and exposed. In fact, some castles had fake drawbridges, wooden ramps that collapsed halfway, dumping troops into the moat. Nothing like charging into battle and landing face first in a medieval sewage pit. But the moat wasn't just an obstacle, it was a weapon of attrition. Because most moats were connected to the castle's waste system. Human waste, animal waste, old food, blood from the butcher. Everything ended up in the same swirling stew of misery. So if you fell in, you didn't just get wet, you got infected. Records from a 13th century siege show that 30% of attackers who fell into the moat died not from wounds, but from disease. Dysentery, sepsis, gangrene, you name it. The moat was the medieval version of chemical warfare. And it was, but wait, it gets worse. Some castles went full mad genius and used poison moats, dumping lime or even tannery chemicals into the water to discourage crossings. Imagine charging through a trench full of acidic sludge while archers laugh at you from above. That's not just defense, that's medieval trolling. And then there were the underground water defenses. Yes, some castles had hidden reservoirs, wells and subterranean cisterns that defenders could access even during a long siege. While the attackers were drinking muddy trench water, the castle was sipping from its private reserve. One castle in Spain had a secret tunnel that led to a clean spring over half a mile away. And yes, it still works today. Even more brilliant? Some castles had drain systems that could empty their own moat to trap enemies. Imagine thinking you've crossed the water safely, only to have the defenders pull a lever and leave you stuck in a pit with no escape. And don't forget the bridge traps. Some drawbridges had hidden spike plates beneath them. If attackers stormed across too quickly, the defenders could drop the bridge mid-charge, leaving everyone impaled or tumbling backwards into the moat. Because in castle warfare, you didn't need to kill the enemy. You just had to confuse them, humiliate them, and let the moat finish the job. You can fight soldiers. You can fight siege towers. But what you can't fight is doubt. And that's exactly what castles used to win battles, before they even began. Because beyond the walls and weapons, castles were designed to mess with your mind. They didn't just resist you, they unsettled you. Every sound, shadow, and dead end was carefully constructed to make you question everything, including your chances of survival. Let's start with sound. Many castles were built with deliberate echo chambers, long stone hallways and vaulted ceilings that amplified and twisted sound. Footsteps doubled in volume. A single creaking door echoed like thunder, and defenders used this to full effect. One document from a 14th century siege describes guards banging metal shields deep inside the castle to simulate the arrival of reinforcements. The attackers fled. There were no reinforcements, just good acoustics. Even worse were the talking walls. Certain corridors were designed to carry voices from one room to another. You'd hear whispers, actual conversations, through walls you thought were solid. Invading troops sometimes believed the defenders were watching them from within the walls. They weren't wrong. Castles turned architecture into paranoia. Now imagine you're inside, disoriented, tense, trying to find your way. You open a wooden door and step into a passage that leads to nowhere, or worse, back to where you just came from. Welcome to the maze defense. Some castles featured intentional architectural confusion, mismatched corridors, uneven staircases, and decoy rooms. There were false doors built just to waste your time or trap you in kill zones. One fortress in Eastern Europe had 4 identical doors in its central hall. 3 opened into stone walls. The 4th led to a narrow staircase lined with arrow slits. And you wouldn't know until it was too late. That's not a hallway, that's a test. And if you fail, you die in a hallway designed by someone who hated you centuries before you were born. And then came the optical tricks. Towers with windows too small to be seen from the ground, but perfect for a crossbow. Angled walls that made the castle look smaller or weaker than it was. Even fake damage, broken stones or scorched gates, meant to lure attackers into thinking the castle was vulnerable. It wasn't. You were. Some castles even use mirrors and polished metal to redirect light into dark hallways, creating glowing illusions in places that should have been pitch black. Imagine walking into a medieval fortress and seeing a beam of light dance across the wall in total silence. You'd start thinking twice about everything. And just when you think you've adjusted, the booby traps begin. Hot oil gets all the credit, but the truth is, defenders used anything they could heat: water, sand, fat, even ashes. Some castles preferred boiling vinegar mixed with quicklime, not to kill, but to blind. A full charge up the stairs only to get a face full of acid steam? That's not war. That's psychological collapse. Other defenders got creative. One fortress in Italy famously dropped live beehives through murder holes. Not flaming pitch, not rocks, bees. Dozens of them. Buzzing, angry, and bouncing off armor until someone panicked and ran. And when one soldier runs, the rest usually follow. That's fear doing the fighting. Then there were the animal illusions. Some castles kept dogs or birds specifically trained to howl or scream when invaders crossed certain thresholds. You'd hear unholy screeches echo through a dark, wet corridor, convinced some demon just woke up in the basement. Spoiler, it was a very hungry goose. But not all defenses screamed at you. Some stared you down. Statues placed at choke points, gargoyles carved with twisted expressions, eyes that followed you through torchlight. One castle in Spain even painted murals inside their gates, showing attackers being executed, just to set the mood. Imagine pushing through the door and seeing a 10-foot-tall image of your own death. That's not intimidation, that's psychological warfare in high definition. And it didn't stop when you got inside. Defenders would often fake retreats, letting attackers take an outer courtyard, only to ambush them with hidden soldiers emerging from trapdoors and tunnels. Some castles even had secret balconies, hidden platforms where defenders could drop boulders directly onto celebrating troops. Nothing says you just got played like being crushed by a rock you never saw coming. Even castle lighting was weaponized. Torches were placed to create deep shadows and blind spots, so attackers never saw where the next blow was coming from. Some passages were lit to cast looming shadows that made single guards look like entire squads. Because when you're scared, disoriented, and sleep-deprived, the brain fills in the gaps. And the castle lets it. So no, castles didn't need a huge army to win. They just needed to let you inside, and let your mind do the rest. Attacking a castle was one thing, but waiting it out. That's where most armies lost, because medieval castles weren't just ready for a fight, they were ready for a siege. Weeks, months, sometimes years, while attackers froze, starved, and argued over rotten bread, the people inside the castle were fine. Let's start with food. Most castles had massive underground storage rooms built specifically for siege survival. Grain, salted meat, dried beans, smoked fish, anything that wouldn't spoil. Some had ventilated pantries carved into the stone, keeping things cool even in summer. One fortress in Austria had enough grain to feed 300 people for a full year. And they didn't just stock food, they rotated it. Records from one English manor show that castle cooks followed a schedule to move older stores forward and replace them with fresh supplies, like a medieval grocery shelf. That's not just survival, that's logistics. Now, water. You'd think cutting off the castle's water supply would do the trick. Think again. Many castles had hidden wells, sometimes right in the center of the keep, protected by thick walls. Others had underground tunnels leading to springs, rivers, or cisterns. A castle in Spain had a sloped tunnel that funneled rainwater into a sealed reservoir beneath the floor. Even under siege, they had fresh drinking water every day. Meanwhile, the attacking army was boiling mud to make soup. And it wasn't just about food and water, it was about endurance. Castles had multi-use fireplaces for heating, cooking, drying clothes, and preserving meat. The smoke also helped keep bugs away and cured the wooden beams above, making the structure stronger over time. That's right, the castle aged like wine. And while defenders stayed warm and well-fed, the attackers got restless. Siege warfare was slow. You couldn't storm the gate, you couldn't climb the walls, and you couldn't starve them out. So most armies just sat there, cold, wet, hungry. That's when the castle started to mess with them. Defenders used noise warfare, ringing bells, playing instruments, or yelling from the battlements at night to keep invaders awake. Some castles even released livestock onto the walls, just to taunt the enemy with fresh meat they couldn't have. Psychological torture? Absolutely. Oh, and sometimes the defenders faked surrender. They'd raise flags, lower bridges, and even walk out with empty food baskets, just to lure attackers closer before unleashing a hidden ambush. A fortress in Eastern Europe pulled this trick 3 times in one siege. The attackers fell for it every time. But here's the real genius: fire control. While most armies relied on campfires and torches, castles used sealed lanterns, stone hearths, and banked coals, keeping heat without wasting wood. Wood which, by the way, was also stockpiled in massive underground stacks. Some castles even had designated fire marshals during sieges, whose only job was to walk the halls and keep the flames safe. And when all else failed, there was the escape plan. Many castles had secret tunnels called posterns, leading out through cliffs, forests, or even beneath rivers. These weren't for cowardly retreats, they were for counterattacks. A handful of trained defenders could sneak out at night, sabotage siege equipment, steal supplies, or set fire to the enemy camp. One group even returned with the enemy's food cart. So while attackers were chewing bark, the defenders were roasting stolen sausages. Because surviving a siege wasn't just about holding out. It was about outsmarting everyone waiting outside the gate. Castles didn't just survive attacks, they anticipated them. They didn't need massive armies. They had gravity, geometry, and goose-powered fear tactics. From spiral stairs that broke your swing to sewage systems that broke your spirit, every stone was part of a smarter system. These places weren't just strong. They were strategic, sadistic, and honestly kind of brilliant. So next time you walk through a castle and think, wow, cool old building, just remember, that building was designed to kill you, slowly, while laughing. If this castle blew your mind, wait until you see what medieval peasants did with a pot of soup and a pile of straw. Subscribe for more stories where mud beats metal, poop defeats power, and brains always win over brute force. And tell us below, if you were attacking a castle, where would you lose your nerve first?